"You are going to get us all killed, Miss Bancroft, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise." The words landed like a slap across a fire-scorched silence. 12 people stood in a ragged semicircle at the edge of the worst stretch of the South Dakota Badlands anyone in the party had ever seen, and every single pair of eyes swung from Harlan Foot's red, furious face to Mamie Bancroft's calm, unreadable one. The sun was a brutal white coin overhead, burning so hot the cracked earth seemed to breathe. Water was down to less than 2 canteens. One horse had already gone lame, and the man who had sold himself as their guide 3 days ago had ridden off in the night with half their silver and the only reliable compass in the group. Mamie did not flinch. She stood with her worn leather saddlebag slung across one shoulder, her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years, her gray eyes moving slowly across the broken landscape with an expression that looked almost like recognition. She was reading something out there that none of them could see. That was the part that terrified them. That was the part that made Harlan Foot's voice crack with something very close to panic when he said it again. "I am telling every soul in this party right now, we do not follow this woman. She is a drifter. She has no land, no claim, no family name anyone here can verify. She appeared out of nowhere 3 days ago, and she has been pointing us deeper into this wasteland ever since." "Northwest," Mamie said quietly. "I have been pointing us northwest. Into nothing. Into the Cheyenne River Valley, Mr. Foot, about 11 miles from where we are standing." A murmur moved through the group like wind through dry grass. David Lawson stood near the back of the semicircle, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his jaw tight. He had not spoken yet. He was the kind of man who did not speak until he had something worth saying, and right now he was watching Mamie Bancroft with an expression he could not quite name. He had been watching her for 3 days. He had watched her study the stars the first night while everyone else slept, crouching over her saddlebag by the dying fire, drawing things in a worn notebook with a stub of pencil. He had watched her press her palm flat against the ground and tilt her head as if she were listening to something underground. He had watched her read the landscape the way a scholar reads a page, quickly, confidently, without hesitation. He was not sure he trusted her. But he was not sure he trusted Harlan Foot either. "We are going to vote," Foot announced, and his voice had the tight, brittle confidence of a man who already believed he had won. "Every person here gets a say. All in favor of turning back east, raise your hand." 7 hands went up immediately. Foot looked triumphant. Then he looked at David Lawson, whose arms were still crossed, whose hand had not moved, and he looked at Mamie Bancroft, who was no longer looking at Foot at all. She was looking at David, and that, though none of them knew it yet, was where the whole story truly began. 3 days earlier, the trouble had started at a river crossing outside a small settlement called Grover's Ford, which was not much more than a trading post, a saloon, and a livery stable set against a sky so wide it made a person feel like a speck of dust. It was the summer of 1882, and the Badlands of Dakota Territory were no joke even to men who had spent their entire lives on the frontier. To the 9 settlers and 3 hired hands who made up what Harlan Foot had grandly called his relocation party, the Badlands were something close to their secret darkest fear made physical. They had heard the stories, wagons that went in and did not come out, bones found years later miles from where people expected them. The landscape had a way of folding back on itself, of looking like one thing from a distance and another thing entirely up close, of swallowing direction whole. They had hired a guide named Cutter Briggs in Grover's Ford, a weathered man of about 50 who claimed he had crossed the Badlands 17 times and knew every dry creek bed and hidden spring by heart. He had a confident voice and a sun-creased face that looked like experience, and Harlan Foot had shaken his hand and paid him $30 in silver before anyone else could raise an objection. David Lawson had raised one anyway. "He is drinking," David said quietly to Foot the evening before they set out. "Not social drinking. He is medicating something." "He knows the land," Foot said, and that was that. David was not part of Foot's family group. He was not part of anyone's group. He was traveling alone, heading toward a land claim in the Black Hills that he had won in a poker game 6 months ago and had been making his way toward ever since, taking odd jobs along the route to keep himself fed and his horse shod. He was 31 years old, built like a man who had been doing hard physical work since childhood, with dark eyes and a quiet way of watching people that tended to make men nervous and women curious. He had agreed to ride with Foot's party for protection in numbers. It was a practical decision, not a social one. He did not particularly like Harlan Foot. He liked Mamie Bancroft even less at first. Or rather, he did not know what to make of her at all. She had arrived at the trading post in Grover's Ford the same afternoon as everyone else, riding alone on a roan mare that was clearly well cared for despite being trail-worn. She had no wagon, no group, no obvious destination written on her face. She purchased supplies with careful economy, spoke to no one unnecessarily, and asked the trading post's owner a long series of very specific questions about the terrain ahead that the owner clearly found both impressive and slightly unsettling. When she pulled out a collection of hand-drawn maps from her saddlebag and spread them across the post's counter, David had drifted close enough to look without being obvious about it. They were extraordinary. Not purchased maps, not copies of anything he had seen before, but original surveys drawn in a precise, confident hand, annotated with notes about seasonal water sources, geological formations, elevation changes, and star bearings. He had looked at them for about 30 seconds before he understood that whoever had made these maps had spent years doing it. This was not a hobby. This was a life's work. He looked up and found her watching him. "You can ask," she said, rolling the nearest map and sliding it back into its leather tube without hurry. "Who made those?" "I did." He held her gaze for a moment. "You surveyed the Badlands. Parts of it. The parts that matter most for crossing." She tucked the tubes back into her saddlebag. "I have been through twice before. Different routes. I know a third one that is about 40% shorter than anything your guide Briggs is likely to know. You heard us hire him." I heard the conversation from 6 feet away. "This is a small trading post, Mr. Lawson. David Lawson. Mr. Lawson." She looked at him steadily, and he noticed that her eyes were not simply gray. They were the particular gray of storm clouds before rain with something alive and shifting in them. "I am Mamie Bancroft. I am going to offer to guide your party across. I expect they will say no, which is fine, but I want it on the record that I offered." "Why do you expect they will say no?" She gave him a look that said she thought the question answered itself, and then she picked up her saddlebag and walked out into the afternoon sun. She was right. When she made the offer to Foot that evening, he laughed. Not cruelly exactly, but dismissively in a way that managed to be worse. He thanked her very politely and told her they had a guide and that she was welcome to ride along if she wished, but he was sure she understood that actual navigation was a matter best left to experienced frontiersmen. Mamie had said very calmly, "Your guide is going to run on you." Foot's face had gone stiff. "I beg your pardon." "Within 2 days. Men like that always do. I can tell by the way he is packing his saddlebag. He is keeping things separate on purpose. Easy to grab and go." She had looked at him with those storm cloud eyes that gave nothing away emotionally but communicated everything in terms of pure, clear intelligence. "When he does, I will be here. The offer stands." She had walked away again, and Foot had turned to the nearest man in his party, shaken his head, and muttered something about drifters with delusions of competence. David had said nothing. But he had watched Mamie cross the firelit camp to where her roan mare was picketed, run a hand down the horse's neck with genuine tenderness, and then sit cross-legged beside her own small fire and open that worn notebook to a fresh page. He had gone back to his own bedroll and stared at the stars for a long time before sleeping. Cutter Briggs ran on the second night, just as she had predicted. He took the compass, a portion of the group's food supply, and the trust that Foot had placed in him. He left behind nothing but horse tracks heading south and the very specific terror of 12 people standing in the middle of the Badlands with no clear sense of direction. Foot's reaction to the betrayal was loud, profane, and ultimately unproductive. He spent the first hour after discovering Briggs was gone cycling through rage, denial, and recrimination in roughly equal parts. David, meanwhile, quietly climbed to the highest point on the nearest ridge and studied the terrain and the sun position for 15 minutes. He came back with a general sense of east and an honest admission that beyond that, he was not confident. Then Mamie had unrolled her maps. She spread them on the flat top of a boulder and weighted the corners with small stones, and she began to talk. Not performatively, not in the loud voice of someone trying to convince a skeptical audience. She spoke the way a person speaks when they know what they know so well that uncertainty has simply stopped occurring to them as a possibility. She explained exactly where they were based on 3 visible geological formations she identified by name and coordinates. She explained the route she intended to take, why it avoided the 2 most dangerous dry stretches of the standard crossing, where the reliable spring was that nobody else seemed to know about, and precisely what the star bearings would be that night to confirm their heading. Half the party listened with visible uncertainty. The other half, including Foot, listened with visible skepticism. David listened with complete, focused attention. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. Both were good questions, the kind that tested the edges of her knowledge without trying to undermine it. She answered both immediately and with specifics he had no way to fabricate or verify, which told him everything. He looked at Foot and said, "She knows what she is talking about." Foot said he appreciated the input and remained unconvinced. And so they had spent the next 2 days in an increasingly uncomfortable compromise, with Mamie providing direction that most of the party followed with reluctance, and Foot providing a running commentary of doubt that eroded trust the way water erodes stone. Every slight deviation from what people expected caused a fresh wave of anxiety. Every landmark that looked unfamiliar became evidence that she was leading them wrong, and every time she said they were on course, Foot's expression communicated very clearly that he thought she was simply guessing. She was not guessing. David could see that. He could see it in the way she moved across the landscape, pausing to examine specific rock formations, reading the vegetation patterns for water, studying the stars each night with the intensity of a scholar. He had begun to watch her not with suspicion, but with a complicated mix of admiration and something else he was not yet ready to name. He had spent his life around capable people, men who knew their trades and their land, but he had never seen anyone read a landscape the way she did. It was not just knowledge, it was a kind of intimacy. She knew this country the way you know a person you have spent years learning. He found himself thinking about her when he should have been thinking about other things. He found himself positioning himself near her at the evening camp, close enough to overhear her murmured calculations, to watch her annotate her maps by firelight. He found himself wishing she would look at him the way she looked at the stars, with that focused, open, hungry attention. She had not yet. She was too busy surviving and being doubted to look at anything but the work. And now they were here. The worst moment. 12 people at the edge of a stretch of Badlands that looked, to any untrained eye, like an absolute dead end. A maze of eroded white and gray rock formations, sharp-cut ravines, and dust-pale earth that all looked identical in every direction. And Foot's hand count was 7-5 against following Mamie, and he looked like a man who believed he had just won the argument. "We turn back east," Foot announced with the satisfaction of a verdict. "We backtrack to the last water point we marked and send 2 riders ahead for help." "You marked no water point," Mamie said. "The creek we passed 2 days ago is dry by now. It was a seasonal trickle. I told you that when we passed it." "The creek is dry," her voice was even. "If you backtrack east, you will be looking for water that does not exist in temperatures that will kill your horses within 36 hours. The spring I know about is 4 miles ahead of us through the formations. There is a passage through those rocks. I have been through it." "There is no passage," said one of Foot's men, a sunburned farmer named Giddings. "I've been looking at those rocks for 2 hours. There is no way through." "There is a way through," she said. "You cannot see it from this angle. The entrance is behind the second largest formation on the left. It opens into a dry river channel that runs northwest for about 3 miles and then meets the spring." Foot looked at her. Then he looked at his 7 supporters. Then he looked at David. David uncrossed his arms. "Mr. Foot," he said, "with respect, your logic is going to kill people. If she is wrong and we follow her, we lose 4 miles. If you are wrong and we backtrack, we lose water, horses, and likely lives. The risk calculation favors following her. You are as fooled as the rest. I am not fooled." David's voice was low and without heat, but it cut through Foot's words like a blade through rope. "I have been watching her work for 3 days. I have asked her specific questions and received specific, verifiable answers. She knows this land, Foot. The question is whether your pride is worth more to you than the lives of the people standing behind you." Silence. In that silence, something shifted. It was one of Foot's own people who moved first, a young woman named Clara Briggs, no relation to the absent guide, who had 2 small children with her and had been visibly terrified for most of the journey. She stepped away from the east-facing group and walked to stand behind Mamie with a quiet, determined set to her jaw. Then Giddings. Then 2 others. The vote had just turned. Foot stood very still for a long moment, looking like a man who had discovered the ground beneath him was not as solid as he thought. Then, with the stiff dignity of someone who had just lost something they were not ready to admit was important, he said, "Fine. We follow the drifter. And when this ends in disaster, every soul here will know whose idea it was." Mamie said nothing. She put her hat back on, turned to face the rock formations, and started walking. David fell into step behind her, and after a moment so did everyone else. He caught up to her within 30 yards, adjusting his long stride to walk beside her rather than behind. "You handled that well," he said. "I did not handle it at all," she replied. "I just kept being right." He almost smiled. "Is that your strategy for dealing with people who doubt you?" She glanced at him sideways, and for the first time he saw something in her face that was not pure focus or pure composure. It was something smaller and more human, something that might have been the ghost of old hurt. "When you have been doubted your whole life, Mr. Lawson, you stop trying to convince people. You just keep going." He did not have an answer for that, and he thought perhaps there was no answer required. They walked. The passage was exactly where she had said it would be. Behind the second largest rock formation, a narrow but entirely navigable gap in the cliff face, wide enough for horses in single file, floored with firm packed earth rather than the loose scree that dominated everything around it. When David saw it, he stopped dead for a full 3 seconds, feeling something happen inside his chest that he could not immediately classify. It was not surprise exactly, because he had already believed her. It was something more like awe, which was not an emotion he was accustomed to feeling, and which therefore hit harder than he was prepared for. He looked at her. She was already threading through the gap without looking back, one hand on the rock face, reading its texture as she passed. "You said you had been through here before," he said, following. "Twice. How did you find it the first time?" She was quiet for a moment. The gap narrowed slightly and they moved through in single file, the rest of the party filing in behind them, the sound of it echoing off the stone walls in a way that felt almost sacred. "I was lost," she said finally. "Genuinely lost, which does not happen to me often. I had been separated from a survey party and I had 1 day of water left. I spent 12 hours reading the rock patterns and the plant growth until I found this place." She paused. "Fear is an excellent teacher, Mr. Lawson." "David," he said. She glanced back at him. "What?" "My name is David. We have been near dying together for 3 days. I think we can dispense with the formalities." Something flickered in those gray eyes, the ghost of something warm. "Mamie," she said quietly and turned back to the path ahead. The dry river channel was exactly as she had described. A broad, flat floor of packed earth, winding northwest through walls of pale stone that rose on either side like the walls of some ancient hallway. It was cooler in here, sheltered from the direct sun, and the horses immediately relaxed in the way horses do when the temperature drops and the path becomes clear. David watched the people around him change as they moved through, watched the tight-shouldered terror slowly release into something that was not yet relief, but was at least the beginning of it. He watched Foot, too. The man walked in silence, his jaw set, his eyes moving between the path ahead and Mamie's back with an expression that was working through something complicated. About a mile into the channel, one of the children, Clara's daughter, who was perhaps 5 years old, fell and scraped her knee badly on the rock floor. Before anyone else had fully reacted, Mamie had turned, crouched, and was examining the injury with calm, gentle hands. She produced a small tin of salve from her saddlebag and a strip of clean linen, and she bandaged the knee with the practiced efficiency of someone who had patched up a great many trail injuries. The little girl, whose name was Rose, looked up at Mamie with the enormous trusting eyes of a child who has just decided that someone is safe. "Are you a doctor?" she whispered. "No," Mamie said, smiling. It was the first full smile David had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, opened it up, let the warmth that had been banked behind all that competence and composure come through at full force. "I am a map maker, but map makers spend a lot of time alone in rough country. You learn to take care of yourself." "And other people?" the little girl asked. "When they let you," Mamie said, and stood up. David had to look away. Something had happened to his chest again, and he was not prepared to examine it closely in present company. They found the spring 2 hours later, right where she had said it would be, where the dry river channel opened out into a wider basin, and the rock face on the north side showed a dark, damp stain that became, as they approached, a true seep of cold, clear water pooling in a natural stone basin. The sound of it, the quiet, steady sound of water moving over stone in the middle of that parched silence, was one of the most beautiful things David had ever heard. Clara began crying. One of the men made a sound that was suspiciously close to a sob. Even the horses seemed to exhale. Foot stood at the edge of the water basin for a long moment without speaking. Then he turned to Mamie, who was letting her roan mare drink from the downstream end, and he said, quietly and without quite meeting her eyes, "I was wrong." She looked at him. "I know. I should have," "Yes," she agreed, not unkindly. "But we are here. That is what matters." Foot nodded, took off his hat, and walked away. It was not a complete accounting for how he had behaved, and David suspected Mamie knew that, but she was not the kind of person who needed the full pound of flesh. She needed the acknowledgement. That was enough. They made camp at the spring for the rest of that day and through the night. It was the first genuinely restful camp since Grover's Ford, and the difference in the group's energy was stark. People talked, laughed, let children run. Someone produced a harmonica and played for about half an hour after supper. The fire was warm and the stars were ridiculous, enormous and close, the way they only get in truly empty country. David found Mamie at the edge of the firelight, sitting on a flat rock with her notebook open, annotating something about the spring in that precise, small handwriting of hers. He stood for a moment trying to decide whether to approach, which was an unusual experience for him because he was not normally indecisive about things. He approached. "You are still working," he said, sitting on a nearby rock without being invited, though he left enough distance to make it easy for her to signal if the company was unwanted. "I am always working when I am in new terrain," she said without looking up. "This spring should be on a reliable map. It is not on any map I have seen. That means I need to note it. So that other people can find it. So that other people can find it," she confirmed. "That is the whole point of maps, Mr. Law," she stopped herself. "David, that is why you do this, the surveying, to help people find their way." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she set the pencil flat in the notebook crease and looked up at the stars, and the firelight caught the line of her jaw and the curve of her mouth, and something in him went very still and very attentive. "My father was a surveyor," she said. "A good one. He taught me to read land before I could read words, which scandalized my mother deeply and delighted me entirely. I used to follow him on survey trips from the time I was about 8 years old. She paused. He died when I was 17. Trail accident in the Colorado Rockies. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of bad luck that kills people in rough country. I am sorry, she looked at him. After he died, I kept going. I had his instruments, his unfinished surveys, and his notebooks. I finished them. Then I started my own. She picked up the pencil again. People have been trying to tell me it is not appropriate work for a woman since approximately the morning after his funeral. I have found that the best response is to just keep doing the work. And the drifting, he asked, a ghost of a smile. You have to drift to survey. You cannot make maps of places you have never been to. Where do you go between surveys? Wherever the next unmapped stretch of country is. She looked at the spring, at the water catching the firelight in small dancing points. I have no fixed home, if that is what you are asking. No family left, no land, just the work and the road. He absorbed this. That does not bother you. She was quiet again. Then, more honestly than he expected, she said, sometimes. When the weather is bad and the trail is long and there is nobody to talk to, sometimes it bothers me a great deal. She closed the notebook. But the alternative is staying still, and I have not managed to find a place worth staying still in yet. The words landed in his chest with a weight he did not fully understand yet, but which he recognized dimly as something that would matter later. He said, "The Black Hills." She turned to look at him. "What about them?" "I have a claim in the Black Hills." "Land, not a mine, land, a valley. I have not seen it yet." He looked at the stars. "But from everything I have heard, it is country worth knowing." She looked at him for a long moment. In the firelight, with the spring singing quietly behind them and the party murmuring and laughing nearby, the distance between them felt like a question that had been asked but not yet answered. "Then I hope it is everything they say," she said finally. She went back to her notebook. He stayed on his rock, looking at the stars. He did not sleep well that night, but it was a pleasant sort of sleeplessness, the kind that comes not from worry but from a mind that has found something worth turning over. The next morning was clear and cool, the sort of morning that makes the Badlands look briefly beautiful instead of threatening, all the pale rock and dusty earth taking on color in the low light, rose and amber and a clean-washed gray. Mamie had the route planned before anyone else was fully awake, and she laid it out for the party over coffee in the matter-of-fact tone she used for everything navigation-related, which was to say clearly, specifically, and without wasted words. The remaining passage to the Cheyenne River Valley, she explained, was about 7 miles, and it involved no more technical challenges. The worst terrain was behind them. There was a recognized trail about 3 miles ahead that connected to the valley settlements, and once they hit that trail, any of them could navigate without her. Foote listened to this with an expression that had lost most of its former bluster. He looked tired, and older somehow, the way people sometimes do after they have been genuinely wrong about something important and have had to sit with that fact overnight. He thanked her for the information and busied himself with organizing his group for departure. David watched Mamie pack up her bedroll and saddlebag with the quick economy of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She was not a woman who fussed over her possessions or her person, which he found inexplicably attractive. She did what needed doing and then she moved on, and she did it with a grace that was entirely unconscious, entirely functional, like watching a craftsman work. He was in serious trouble and he knew it. He had been in love once before, or something that had worn love's clothing convincingly enough to fool him for about 2 years, until it had revealed itself as something shallower and more transactional. He had not been looking to repeat the experience. He had been, in fact, fairly comfortable with the solitary life, the claim in the Black Hills, the satisfaction of work and land and his own company. And then Mamie Bancroft had unrolled her maps on a boulder in the middle of the worst landscape in Dakota Territory and told 12 doubting people exactly where they were and exactly how to get where they were going. and something had come loose in him that he suspected was not going back. They broke camp and moved out at 7 in the morning. Mamie rode at the front, not dramatically, not performatively, simply because she knew where they were going and everyone else did not. She sat her roan mare with the easy, upright posture of an experienced rider, one hand resting on her thigh, the other loosely on the rein, her gaze moving constantly over the terrain ahead with that particular quality of attention that was, David thought, the most competent-looking thing he had ever seen. He rode beside her. She did not seem to mind. For a while they rode in a silence that was comfortable in a way he had not experienced with very many people. Then she said without preamble, "Tell me about the claim." "The land claim?" "Yes. How did you win it in a poker game?" He glanced at her. "You heard that part of a conversation too." "Grover's Ford small trading post," she reminded him. He almost smiled. "It was in Deadwood about 6 months ago. A man named Callahan was holding the deed as collateral on a substantial debt, which he then lost over about 4 hours of poker. I was not even playing for the deed. I was playing for the cash on the table. The deed came at the end when the cash ran out. You had never seen the land. I had never seen it. I have a written description and a survey map which a friend of mine told me was probably not accurate." "What friend?" "A man named Reeves. He did some survey work in the Black Hills 3 years ago." She was quiet for a moment. "James Reeves." He turned to look at her with genuine surprise. "You know him?" "I know his survey work, and you are right to be skeptical. His elevation measurements for the Black Hills were off by a consistent margin because he was using a barometric altimeter that had been damaged. His horizontal positioning was good, though. If the map shows the valley where you think it is, the valley is probably where it shows." She paused. "Can I see it?" He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the folded survey, and she took it without slowing her mare, unfolded it one-handed, and spent about 45 seconds studying it with that focused, rapid reading that seemed to take in and organize information at a rate that made his own mental processing feel sluggish by comparison. "Your valley is real," she said, handing it back. "It is probably 400 feet lower than this map suggests, which means it will be slightly warmer in winter and slightly more sheltered from northern wind. The creek shown here is likely a year-round water source given the topography. It is good land." She paused. "Actually very good land." He held the survey in his hand for a moment, looking at it differently than he had before because she had just given it weight it had not quite had. "You can tell all that from this map. And from what I know about the general geology of that region, yes." He stared at her. There was no other word for it. He stared, and she noticed, and for the first time in their acquaintance he saw something that might have been the faintest color in her cheeks. "What?" she said, and there was an uncharacteristic uncertainty in the word that she clearly regretted immediately. "Nothing," he said. "I am just—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I have met a lot of capable people. I have never met anyone quite like you." "That is either a compliment or a polite way of saying I am peculiar," she said, and returned her gaze to the terrain ahead. But the color in her cheeks had not entirely faded. They found the trail she had predicted at 3 miles, a wide, well-marked wagon road that ran northwest toward the valley settlements, just exactly where she had said it would be. The moment they hit it, something happened to the group that was almost physical, a collective exhale, a releasing of tension that had been wound tight for days. People straightened in their saddles. Conversations started. The children were allowed to run alongside the horses for a while. Clara came up to ride beside Mamie as they moved down the better road, and she said quietly, "Miss Bancroft, I want you to know that I knew all along you were right. I should have said so sooner. I was scared, and I let other people's fear become my own." "Fear is understandable," Mamie said. "The Badlands are not a forgiving classroom. Still, you saved our lives, and I did not defend you when Mr. Foote was being—" Clara paused diplomatically. "He was afraid too," Mamie said. "Fear makes people look for someone to blame. I have been blamed for a great many things I did not do." She glanced at Clara. Your children are good and brave. You should be proud. Clara's face did something complicated and grateful, and she fell back to ride with her children. David had heard all of this. He was becoming uncomfortably aware that he heard everything Mamie said, and filed it with a significance that suggested his mind had already made a decision that his conscious self had not quite finished processing. They reached the Cheyenne River Valley late in the afternoon of that day, descending from the rough terrain into the most welcome green David thought he had ever seen. Not the wild, formal green of the wealthier East, but the spare, honest green of high plains grassland following a river, willows along the bank, cottonwoods catching the late light. A settlement was visible about 2 miles ahead, larger than Grover's Ford, real buildings, a proper main street, smoke from cook fires, and the distant sound of a cattle operation somewhere to the north. The party stopped at the crest of the descent to look at it, and for a moment nobody said anything because there was nothing to say that the view did not say better. Foot turned to Mamie. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. "I will not forget what you did," he said. "Navigate well," she told him. "That is all the thanks I need." He nodded and rode on, and the rest of the party followed him down the grade toward the settlement, the sound of wheels and hooves and voices fading as they went, leaving David and Mamie alone at the crest with the whole Golden Valley laid out below them and the impossible sky above. He turned to look at her. She was watching the party descend, and her expression was the most unguarded he had seen it, something that looked, if he had to name it, like loneliness. The particular loneliness of someone who belongs to the work more than to any place or person, and who has made their peace with that but has not entirely stopped mourning it. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I need to find a post office. I have maps to send to the Geological Survey in Washington, and then I will pick up the route I was on before your party's disaster intersected with my travel plans." The ghost of that smile again. "Northeast section of the Black Hills hasn't been properly surveyed. I was headed there anyway." He looked at her. A long, quiet look. "So was I," he said. She turned to meet his gaze, and for the first time since he had known her, something changed in the quality of her attention. Instead of the landscape or the path ahead or the notebook in her hands, she was looking at him fully, directly, with those storm cloud eyes that were now entirely still. Not calculating, not doubting, just seeing. "That is quite a coincidence," she said. "I am beginning to think it might not be a coincidence at all," he said. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, 4 or 5. A long time in the silence of the high country with the wind moving the grass below them. Then she gathered her reins, nudged the roan mare into motion, and started down the grade toward the settlement. He rode beside her. The settlement was called Hartwell, and it was large enough to have a hotel, which was the most significant piece of news David had received in several days. They arrived in the early evening and drew little more than a few curious glances, which was the standard response to strangers in most frontier towns where strangers were common currency. Mamie went directly to the post office, and David went to the livery stable to see to both their horses, because she had not asked him to, but he had done it anyway, and she had not argued. He booked 2 rooms at the hotel, and when she emerged from the post office, he told her so, and she looked at him with an expression he could not fully decode and said thank you quietly, and then went inside. He did not see her for 2 hours. He had a bath, which was necessary and overdue, and a meal at the hotel dining room, and he was on his 2nd cup of coffee when she came down the stairs and into the dining room, and he stood up before he had consciously decided to, which surprised him. She had changed. Not dramatically, not into anything fancy. The frontier did not offer much in the way of fancy, but she wore a clean white cotton blouse, and her hair was down, or partly down, pulled back loosely in a way that was different from the strict practicality she maintained on the trail. She looked like herself, but the road dust was gone, and without it she looked younger, and the quiet beauty that had always been there but which she seemed to have no particular interest in emphasizing was suddenly very difficult to ignore. She sat down across from him and ordered coffee and a proper meal, and ate with the same unhurried competence she applied to everything else. "I heard back from the survey," she said. "By wire, actually. They received my last submission and they want the Black Hills work by spring. That is good news." "It is. It also means I cannot afford to lose too much time." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I was thinking about your valley." "Were you?" "The survey your friend Reeves did is close enough to accurate that you can find the land. But the boundaries described in the deed are based on landmarks that may have shifted or been misidentified." She looked at him. "You could spend months looking for the right parcel, or you could take someone who can read the survey against the actual terrain and identify it within a day." Looked at her steadily. "Are you offering to help me find my land?" "I am pointing out that I am going to that region anyway for my own work," she said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has made an offer and is watching to see how it lands. "The practical overlap is obvious." "Mamie," she looked at him. "I appreciate the practical framing," he said, "but I would like you to come with me because I would like your company, not just because of the surveying." A pause, long enough to be meaningful. "The company," she said, as if testing the word. "Yes." She looked at her coffee cup. When she looked up again, the careful neutrality had shifted slightly, like a door opening just a crack onto something warmer. "I have never been good at company," she said. "I have always been better at the work." "I know," he said. "I think you might be better at company than you realize." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sounds of Hartwell in the evening came through the window, the distant piano from the saloon, voices, horses, the ordinary sounds of a small frontier town going about its end of day. "We would need to establish clear terms," she said finally. "Whatever terms you like. I lead on navigation, always." "Naturally," he said. "I do not take direction on my surveying work. I do it the way I do it. I would not know where to begin directing you." And she stopped, looked at him with something that was undefended and slightly exposed. "I do not know what I am doing, David. When it comes to the other part, I am very good at maps and I am not experienced at." She stopped again. He said very quietly, "Neither am I not at the part that matters." She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, set it down again. "All right," she said. "We ride together." He felt something settle in his chest with the warm certainty of a thing that has found its right place, like a key in a lock. "All right," he said. They left Hartwell 2 mornings later, provisioned, rested, their horses sound, heading northeast into country that opened up before them with the generosity of the northern plains in early summer. The grass was coming in well from recent rains. The sky had the deep, reliable blue of settled weather, and the terrain, though rough in places, was nothing like the Badlands. It was simply big and clean, and honest in the way that wild country is honest, asking nothing of you that you are not already carrying. They fell into a rhythm that surprised him with how natural it felt. Mamie navigated, obviously, and he found himself learning from her in a way that had nothing to do with formal instruction. She talked about what she was seeing as they moved, not because she was teaching, but because she was thinking aloud, and he paid attention, and gradually he began to see things he had ridden past blindly for years. The way certain plants only grew near water, the way the light changed over different types of soil, the way the land told its own history if you knew the language. She asked him questions too, about the ranching he had done in his 20s, about the trail drives he had ridden, about what the Black Hills were like from the perspective of someone who had not seen them yet, but had been thinking about them for months. She asked with the same intense, focused quality she brought to everything, not polite conversation filling, but genuine curiosity, and he discovered that being genuinely listened to was a more powerful experience than he had remembered. On the 3rd night out from Hartwell, they camped by a shallow creek, and the stars came out extraordinary, the full sweep of the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. Mamie sat cross-legged on her bedroll with her notebook and her star tables, taking readings with a small sighting instrument that fit in her palm, and David sat nearby watching her without pretending to be doing anything else. She was used to being watched when she worked. She worked the same way regardless. But after a while she set down the instrument and looked up at the stars herself, just looking, not measuring, and he realized he had not seen her simply look at something without purpose before. Without the measuring and the notating and the processing. "What do you see?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The same thing everyone sees, probably. The same stars other people have been navigating by for thousands of years." She paused. "My father used to say that the stars were the first map, that every navigation system we have ever built is just a conversation with the sky that human beings started having the moment they needed to find their way home." He looked at the stars. "That is beautiful." He was a beautiful thinker, a small pause. "I miss him. Still, it has been 11 years and I still turn to tell him things." Her voice was even, but there was something in it that was very real and very careful at the same time, the voice of someone who has learned to carry grief without letting it show too much, not because they are ashamed of it, but because showing it too much requires a particular kind of trust. He looked at her. "Tell me one." She turned to look at him, not understanding. "One of the things you would have told him," he said. "Tell me." Her expression shifted. Something softened. She looked back at the stars for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter, and the carefulness was gone from it. "I found a spring today that is not on any map," she said. "And it was exactly where I calculated it should be, and I was right, and nobody had to doubt me this time. I was just right quietly by myself. And it was," she stopped. "It was enough. It has always been enough. But lately I have found myself wishing there was someone to tell." David said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me, always, whenever you find something worth telling." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight her face was entirely open, all the armor down, and he thought it was the most honest, most vulnerable, most completely beautiful thing he had ever seen. He did not kiss her. Not yet. He was learning her particular rhythm, the way she needed space and time and the absence of pressure to move toward anything, and he was willing, more than willing, to give her all of that. But he reached out and took her hand where it rested on her knee, and she looked down at their joined hands for a moment, and then she looked back at the stars, and she did not pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, in the dark and the starlight and the creek sound, while the Milky Way wheeled overhead in its ancient indifference to the very small but very significant thing that was beginning between two people on a blanket below it. The Black Hills appeared on the horizon on the 6th day, rising from the plains like a dark island, exactly what their name promised, tree-covered and distinct against the paler landscape. Mamie studied them for a long time before they descended into the foothills, cross-referencing the view with her maps and the survey she carried for David's claim. "There," she said, pointing. "That lower ridge on the north face. The valley you are looking for is behind it. How can you tell from here?" She showed him the survey, then pointed to two specific rock formations visible on the skyline. "Those two landmarks are described in the deed. They are exactly positioned relative to each other in the way the survey shows. The valley is between them and the next ridge, running roughly east to west." She looked at him. "You have very good land, David." He had been thinking about that since she first looked at his survey. Good land. Her estimation of it, which he now trusted absolutely, meant more to him than he could reasonably account for. They crossed into the Black Hills proper that afternoon, and the change in the country was immediate and dramatic. Pine trees replaced the open grass, the air cooled and became fragrant, and the light came through the canopy in shafts that turned the forest floor into something from a painting. Mamie rode with her head turning constantly, absorbing the topography, making notes as she went. She was clearly in her element in a new way, the way a musician is in their element with a new instrument, familiar with the principles but excited by the specific voice. They found the valley the next morning. It was exactly as she had predicted, slightly lower than the survey showed, warmer and more sheltered, a broad, east-west valley with a creek running down its center and grass that was already knee-high in early summer, surrounded by pine-covered ridges that blocked the northern wind. It was private without being closed, spacious without being exposed. It was the kind of land that a person could look at for the first time and feel, without being able to fully explain why, that they could make a life here. David stood at the head of the valley and did not say anything for a long time. Mamie stood beside him and waited. "It is more than I imagined," he said finally. "It usually is when the land is right," she said. He turned to look at her. The morning light was full on her face, and the valley was behind them, and she was looking at the land with her clear, steady attention. And he thought about what she had said on that first night, about not having found a place worth staying still in. He thought about the loneliness he had seen in her face at the crest of the descent into Hartwell when the party rode away without her. He thought about her saying she was always working because the work was what she had. "Mamie," he said. She turned to him. "I am going to say something that may be presumptuous, and I want you to know that you have every right to tell me it is," he began. "Just say it," she said. "I would like you to stay." He held her gaze. "Not to give up the surveying. Not to give up anything. I would like to build something here, and I would like to build it with you. And if you want to map the entire Black Hills while doing it, I will build the house so that your study faces north and gets the best light." He paused. "I am in love with you. I have been since you told Harlan Foote the direction was northwest in a voice that said you had never been less afraid of anything in your life. I am telling you now because I have been carrying it, and I am not good at carrying things I have already decided about." She stared at him. It was the first time he had seen her look entirely undone, the steady composure and the precise intelligence and the carefully maintained self-sufficiency all suspended at once, leaving just the woman underneath, young and surprised and something that looked like desperately hopeful. "David," she said, and her voice was different, smaller in a way that contained more, not less. "I am not asking you to give up anything," he said again. "I am asking you to add to it. We can add to each other. That is what I am hoping." She stepped toward him, and he thought she was going to say something, but instead she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and she looked at him with those gray eyes that were storm clouds becoming something else, becoming clear sky, and she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. Mamie Bancroft did not do things tentatively. It was certain and real, and it tasted like 3 days of Colorado pine air and creek water and 6 days of wanting. And he kissed her back with everything he had, his arms going around her and the valley spread out below them, and the morning light coming over the ridge. When they pulled apart, she was still holding his jaw and her eyes were bright. "I have been afraid," she said, and he could hear what the admission cost her. "Not of the land, of this, of wanting something I could lose." "I know," he said. "I am still afraid." "So am I," he said, "but here we are anyway." She looked at him for another moment, and then she smiled, the full smile, the one that changed her face entirely, and she stepped back and turned to look at the valley with a different kind of attention than she had used for any landscape before, the attention of someone who was allowing themselves to imagine something. "I want a south-facing window in the study," she said. His heart turned over completely. "Whatever you want. And room for a lot of maps. I will build entire walls of shelves." She looked at him, still smiling. "You do not know how to build." "No," he agreed. "But you can probably draw a blueprint." She laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, surprised out of her, and it rang in the valley like something that had been waiting for permission. They spent the next week surveying the valley claim properly, with Mamie's instruments and her expertise and his labor as she directed it. It was the best kind of partnership, the kind where each person's contribution is different and genuine and actually needed. She told him where the land boundaries were with precision that his deed description only approximated. She identified the best building site, sheltered from the north, with water access and a gentle southern exposure. She mapped every water source, every soil type, every tree stand, in a document that would serve double duty as both a property survey and the first proper map of this specific valley. He built things and fixed things and lifted things, and thought about the future in a way that was completely new, forward-facing and specific. instead of the general, slightly unfocused forward-looking of a person who does not quite know what they are building toward. They worked side by side all day and talked by firelight all evening, and gradually she told him more things, not all at once, not easily, but consistently, the way trust builds in careful increments, each disclosure making the next one slightly less frightening. She told him about the survey parties she had ridden with that had not treated her well. She told him about the man in Denver who had stolen 2 of her surveys and submitted them to the Geological Survey under his own name, and how she had proved the fraud and retrieved credit for them, but not before she had spent 3 months in a kind of cold fury that had driven her back to the wilderness, because she could not stand the dishonesty of human company for a while. He listened to all of it and felt the particular, protective anger of a man who understands exactly what was taken from someone he loves, and he told her so, and she looked at him in a way that said she was not used to being angry on behalf of, and found it more comforting than she expected. She asked him things, too, about his family, which was a subject he approached with a careful brevity that told her it was complicated. His father had been a hard man, not cruel but unreachable, the kind of hardness that comes from a frontier life that costs too much and eventually stops giving back. His mother had died when he was 12. He had 2 brothers, both in Texas, both fine but distant in the way that some families become when the center holding them together is gone, and they have never properly acknowledged it. "You have been alone too," she said, "for a long time, yes, but you are not afraid of it the way I am. I am afraid of different things." He looked at the fire. "I am afraid of building something and having it matter and then losing it. I am afraid of caring about something too much and then having nothing left of myself when it goes." A pause. "But I am more afraid of not trying than I am of that." She reached out and took his hand the way he had taken hers on the 3rd night, and they sat in the dark with the valley quiet around them and said nothing more because there was nothing more that needed saying just then. 6 weeks after they arrived in the valley, David rode to the nearest settlement, a growing town called Custer about 12 miles south, and came back with a preacher, a witness who was a jovial man named Henderson who ran the general store there, and a bottle of good whiskey. He had talked to Mamie about it the week before, not as a question exactly, but as a thing he was asking her to consider seriously and tell him honestly what she thought. She had been quiet for a long time, long enough that he had begun to compose something graceful to say about understanding if she needed more time, and then she had said, "Yes," very simply and clearly, and gone back to her map annotation, and he had stood there for a moment feeling like a man who has just been given more than he asked for. The wedding took place in the valley on a clear August morning, with Henderson as witness, and the preacher reading from the Bible he had packed in his saddlebag, and the ceremony was brief and genuine, and without any of the fuss that Mamie would not have tolerated and David did not need. She wore her best dress, which was the white cotton blouse she had worn to dinner in Hartwell and a better skirt than the trail one, and she had her hair down, and she looked at him when she said the words with the same directness she brought to everything, clear and certain and unambiguous. He said his words looking directly back at her, meaning all of them, feeling the weight of each one. When the preacher declared them married and David kissed her, Henderson cheered enthusiastically. The preacher smiled in the tolerant way of a man who has seen a great many frontier weddings and found them better than the formal ones, and the horses, picketed nearby, were completely unimpressed. They ate a proper meal that evening that Mamie cooked, and David ate with the reverent appreciation of a man who has been eating trail food for months, and Henderson and the preacher stayed for supper and then rode back south, and the valley was theirs, and the night was clear and full of stars. The first structure went up in September, not yet the permanent house, which was a winter project and a serious one, but a solid temporary shelter that David built with lumber from Custer and Mamie's careful blueprints, and which was warm and weather-tight, and had the south-facing window she had requested, and a shelf already built for her map tubes. She submitted her Black Hills survey to the Geological Survey in Washington in October, the most comprehensive survey of the northern Black Hills yet completed, and the letter she received in response was effusive enough that even Henderson at the general store was impressed when David mentioned it, and said that his wife was clearly a remarkable woman. "She is," David said. "She really is." He meant it in the way that people mean things when they have had time to see the full depth of what they mean. Not the abstract admiration of the early days in the Badlands, though that had been real too. The specific, detailed daily knowledge of who she was, all the layers of her, the brilliant navigator and the careful scholar, and the woman who sang quietly to herself, while she worked and cried with unexpected force at a lame horse they found on the road in November, and nursed back to health with 6 weeks of patience and good feed, and who woke up every morning looking at the sky through the south window, as if checking in with it, confirming that the world was still where she had left it the night before. He loved all of it. He loved all of her, more each day in the way that good love works, deepening rather than diminishing. She loved him back in the specific, unspectacular, daily way that was her nature, quietly and thoroughly, and with a commitment that was bone-deep because when Mamie Bancroft decided something was true, she did not change her mind. She loved him in the way she loved her work, with her full intelligence and full attention and no part of herself held back for safety. She had been afraid of this. She had been right to be afraid, because losing it now would have been catastrophic. But she was also, for the first time in her adult life, not alone, and the difference that made was so comprehensive that sometimes it ambushed her in the middle of ordinary moments, while pouring coffee or reading a letter, and she would have to stop and acknowledge that she was happy in a way she had not known was possible. The permanent house went up over the winter and spring, David doing most of the heavy construction with Henderson's help and Mamie's architectural direction, which was precise and sensible, and saved them twice from structural decisions that would have been mistakes. It was a good house. A real house, not large but well-made, with a porch facing east for morning sun, the study with its south window and its walls of shelves, a kitchen with a proper stove that arrived by wagon from Custer in March, and a bedroom with a view of the valley through a window that Mamie had specified at exactly the right height so that you could see the creek from the bed in the morning. Their son was born the following September, in the house they had built together in the valley that she had helped him find, delivered by a competent midwife from Custer named Mrs. Alderman, who had been doing this work for 30 years, and handled the whole event with the calm efficiency that Mamie admired, and David, who spent most of those hours in the grip of a fear more comprehensive than anything the Badlands had offered, found deeply reassuring. They named him Thomas, after Mamie's father, and he came into the world with a full set of opinions about it that he expressed immediately and at significant volume. David held him in the first quiet hour and felt something happen to him that he had not been adequately warned about and could not have been. The completeness of it. The weight of a new person in his arms who was part of him and part of Mamie, and who was therefore both of them, and entirely himself at the same time. Mamie lay watching him from the bed with an expression he had never seen before, soft and deeply satisfied in something that looked like wonder, and he went and sat beside her with Thomas, and she put her arm around his shoulders, and they looked at their son together in the lamplight while Mrs. Alderman moved efficiently around them, and the September wind moved through the valley outside. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like a very small person who is not yet sure what is going on," David said. She laughed, and Thomas startled at the sound and then seemed to decide the sound was acceptable and settled. "He will figure it out," she said. "He has your persistence. And your intelligence, hopefully." She looked at him sideways. "That would be ideal." He kissed her temple, and she leaned her head against him, and outside the valley was full of night and stars and the sound of the creek. Harlan Foote wrote a letter that arrived in December, forwarded through 3 post offices to finally reach them in Custer. He was established in the valley he had been heading for. All 12 people from the crossing party had arrived safely, and his family was building a proper operation there. He wrote stiffly but genuinely to say that he had thought about the Badlands crossing many times in the months since, and that he hoped Mamie was well, and that if she was ever in the region of the northern Sioux Falls settlements, she was to consider herself invited for a proper meal by way of a very incomplete apology. Mamie read the letter twice and then propped it on the study shelf next to one of her map tubes and looked at it for a moment. "Are you going to reply?" David asked from the doorway. "Yes," she said. "I will tell him we are well, and I will send him a proper map of the crossing route through the Badlands." She looked at him. "So that the next party that comes through does not have to navigate by doubt." He crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back into him with the easy comfort of two people who have been fitting into each other's shapes long enough to do it without thinking. "You know," he said quietly, "one of these days someone is going to commission those Badlands maps properly and publish them." "The survey has been asking," she said, "and I told them I needed until spring. Thomas will be old enough to travel then with a proper wagon." She paused. "I want to go back through to verify the spring coordinates one more time and add a second route that I found in the survey records, and then I want to write the full crossing guide and submit it, so that nobody else gets stranded in there." "So that nobody else gets stranded in there," she confirmed. He thought about those 12 people standing at the edge of the worst terrain in Dakota Territory, water nearly gone, guide vanished, about to make a fatal turn east. He thought about Mamie standing there with her saddlebag and her maps and her calm, unshakable knowledge of where they were and where they needed to go. He thought about how close it had come, not to disaster, but to the alternative universe in which Harlan Foote had gotten his vote and David had gone east with the rest of them, and Mamie had been left standing at the edge of the Badlands alone, right as always, believed by no one. The thought made something fierce and grateful move through him. "I will drive the wagon," he said. She turned in his arms to look at him. "The claim will still be here. Henderson will check on the stock. I am not sending you back into the Badlands without me." She studied him for a moment with those gray eyes. Then she said, "You know I do not need a guardian." "I know," he said. "I need to go with you." "That is different." She considered this distinction and apparently found it sufficient. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She turned back to her maps, his arms still around her, and he rested his chin on top of her head, and they stood together in the study with the December wind outside and the sound of Thomas beginning to wake up in the next room, and the whole Black Hills winter around them, and the valley their valley, running east to west below the south window with the frozen creek catching what light there was and turning it back at the sky. A year after that, they went back through the Badlands. David drove the wagon. Thomas, who was by then a solid, bright-eyed 10-month-old with his mother's gray eyes and his father's jaw, rode in the wagon bed in a nest of blankets and seemed to find the whole experience tremendously interesting. Mamie rode her roan mare alongside, which was still sound, and seemed to remember the terrain with the focused attention of a horse that had been here before and found the memory relevant. They went through the passage in the rock formation on a crisp October morning, and David, who had walked through it the first time on foot full of doubt and admiration, drove the wagon through it now on a wide, clear day with his wife ahead of him on her mare, and his son watching the rock walls pass with enormous interested eyes. And he felt the particular quality of returning to a place that had mattered and finding it exactly as you left it. Mamie paused at the spring to make her final measurements, precise as always, thorough as always, the little sighting instrument turning in her capable hands. Thomas watched her from the wagon with the focused attention of a child who is cataloging everything the world contains, storing it away. "He watches you work the same way you watch the land," David said. Mamie looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at her with the solemn, absolute concentration of a 10-month-old who is doing his best to understand a very complicated world. She laughed softly, and Thomas decided the laugh was acceptable, as he always did. The guide document she produced that winter was 80 pages long, with detailed maps of 3 separate crossing routes, seasonal water source locations, geological landmark identifications, and a section on reading the Badlands terrain for natural navigation cues that was the first of its kind. She submitted it to the Geological Survey of the United States in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1884 under her full name, Mamie Bancroft Lawson. The survey published it that same year. It was the first comprehensive navigation guide to the Badlands of Dakota Territory, and it saved lives over the years in numbers that could not be fully counted but that were real. Wagon parties and survey teams and lone travelers found their way through terrain that had killed people before because a woman in a wide-brimmed hat had walked those passages by lamplight and by starlight, and by the deep, confident knowledge of a person who had learned to read the world from a man who loved it, and who had spent her life paying that forward. The copy of the published document that arrived at their house in the Black Hills Valley was, to David's mind, the most beautiful object he had ever seen. He said so. Mamie looked at it for a long moment, then set it on the shelf next to the letter from Harlan Foote and her father's original survey notebook, which she had carried in her saddlebag for 11 years, and she looked at all three of those things together and was quiet. "What are you thinking?" David asked. "That he would have loved this," she said. "My father, he would have been so happy about this. He would have been proud of you." "I know." She turned to look at David with clear, steady, direct eyes. "So would yours if he had been the kind of man who could show it." He took that in, let it settle. It was true, the kind of truth that hits cleanly when the right person says it. "Thank you," he said. She walked to him and put her arms around him, her face against his shoulder, and he held her in the small study of the house they had built together, with the south window and the wall of shelves, and the published guide and the old notebooks, and the smell of pine from the open window, and Thomas's voice coming from the kitchen where Mrs. Alderman, who had become something like family in the way that capable women become essential in frontier households, was dealing with the morning. A second child came the following spring. A daughter this time, with David's dark eyes and Mamie's exact, focused way of watching things, who arrived with slightly more drama than Thomas had and considerably less noise about it afterward. They named her Alina, and she was, from the very first morning, a person of serious opinions and great calm, which David remarked was entirely her mother in miniature, and Mamie said was entirely his calm with her brains. And Thomas, who was by then 2 years old and had developed a complete and comprehensive worldview about almost everything, regarded his sister with the dignified tolerance of someone who has consented to share a significant resource. The valley grew around them as the years moved. David added to the claim, purchasing adjacent parcels as they became available, building up a mixed operation of cattle and hay that was modest but solid, the kind of enterprise that did not make a man wealthy but kept a family well and gave back to the land something close to what it gave. He learned from Mamie to read the land the way she did, not with her exact precision, but with a genuine attention that made him a better steward of it. He learned which slopes held water and which ones did not, which stands of trees were signs of deep soil, and which ones were struggling in shallow ground, how the creek behaved in spring and what that told you about the coming summer. She kept working. That had never been in question and was never treated as one. She produced 2 more major survey documents in the next 5 years, one of the northern Black Hills, and one of a section of Wyoming Territory that the survey had specifically requested, both under her professional name. She became, in the close, specialized community of frontier surveyors and geological scientists, a person of significant reputation whose work was cited, whose methods were taught, and whose guide to the Badlands crossing was used for the next 20 years until the railroad made the question academic. She also came home every time. That had not been a negotiation or a rule, it was simply what was true. The valley was where she came back to, the house with the south window. The creek sound in the morning. David, who met her each return with the particular quiet happiness of a man who has learned that people worth loving are worth waiting for. Thomas turned out to have inherited his mother's precise intelligence and his father's physical confidence, and by the time he was 6, was already following Mamie on local survey walks, with the same focused attention he had shown as an infant, asking questions that were occasionally so specific they made her genuinely pause to think. Alina turned out to be someone completely different from either of them, a child of laughter and social confidence, and a deeply pragmatic streak that she seemed to have developed entirely on her own, who could charm Henderson into giving her extra ribbon at the general store, and then use the ribbon to mend the bridle she had broken playing with it, which David said was either commerce or engineering, and Mamie said was clearly both. On a September evening 11 years after David had stood at the edge of the Badlands and watched Mamie Bancroft say northwest in a voice that contained no doubt at all, he sat on the porch of their house in the valley and watched the light go off the ridge to the west, the pine trees catching the last of it, the creek below catching it too, the whole valley in that brief golden state that September evenings make just before they give way to the blue of dusk. Mamie came out of the house and sat beside him, 2 cups of coffee, and the quiet that was their particular kind, the quiet of 2 people who have said most of what they need to say and are comfortable in the space where words are not required. Thomas was somewhere down at the creek. Alina had gone to sleep early, which she did sometimes, with the authority of a person who has decided they are done with the day and no further input is required. "I got another letter from the survey today," she said. He took his coffee. "What do they want this time?" "They want me to consider leading a surveying expedition into the Wyoming Rockies next summer. Proper commission, 3 other surveyors under my direction, full funding." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "It would be 3 months." He looked at the ridge. "That is a long time, I know. It is also exactly the kind of work you have been building toward for 20 years. She looked at him. "Yes." "Then you should go." He looked back at the ridge. "Thomas is old enough to be genuinely useful rather than just enthusiastic. Alina will terrorize the general store in a way that benefits the family financially. I will manage." He glanced at her. "Although I reserve the right to send you an unreasonable number of letters." She looked at him with something that was still, after 11 years, capable of undoing him, that direct, clear, unguarded look that she gave to very few things and to him most of all. "Come for part of it," she said. "The first month before the high country work begins. Bring Thomas. He is ready." He thought about Thomas on the trail with his mother's maps and his father's stride. He thought about the Wyoming Rockies in summer, which he had never seen and which, Mamie had once told him, were the most completely beautiful country she had ever been in. "When do we leave?" he said. She smiled, the full one, the one that was still and always would be the best thing in his particular world. "June," she said. "I want spring to finish before we go." He nodded. He reached out and took her hand, the same gesture as that first night in the Badlands, her hand over his on her knee, the stars above and the fire near, both of them at the beginning of something that had turned out to be more than either of them had known to hope for. The valley settled into evening around them. The creek sound rose in the cooling air. Somewhere down there, Thomas was probably already measuring something with a stick, cross-referencing it against some system only he understood, his mother's child in the very best possible way. The stars came out above the ridge, one at a time and then all at once, the first map, the conversation that human beings had been having with the sky since the first person needed to find their way home. Mamie looked up at them with that old, familiar attention checking in, confirming the world. David looked at her. He thought about a trading post in Grover's Ford and a woman unrolling maps on a counter, and a question he had not known yet was the beginning of everything. He thought about 12 people at the edge of the worst terrain in Dakota Territory, doubt and fear, and the single clear voice that had said northwest and meant it and been right. He thought about a passage through rock and a hidden spring, and a valley that she had found him from 40 miles away with nothing but mathematics and knowledge, and an extraordinary, irreplaceable mind. He thought that of all the things a person could be led to in a life, the truest and best was here, where the work was honest and the land was good, and the person beside you knew exactly where they were going and was willing, when it mattered most, to let you come along. "Still the most capable person I have ever met," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised, because he had said it out of nowhere, and it sounded like the end of a long thought she had not been part of. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "Just thinking," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that were clear sky now, permanently, the storm having long since passed. Then she leaned her head on his shoulder the way she did when she had decided that proximity was the right thing and words were beside the point. "Good," she said simply. The valley was dark and full and theirs. The stars did their ancient navigational work above it, indifferent and magnificent. And the two of them sat on the porch of the house they had built together, at the end of a day that was simply a good one, in the life they had made from a meeting in the Badlands, and a direction that everyone had doubted until it turned out to be exactly right.